Capcom has been on a bit of a tear in recent years, releasing banger after banger so long as you ignore RE-verse. And they've also been the only publisher that's doing well-made and proper remakes that aren't just glorified remasters. However, their current progress in that regard is pushing them closer and closer to remaking RE6, which I'm convinced might just be a sign of the apocalypse. So in order to avoid doomsday, I suggest we look over some other titles that maybe needed some more time in the oven. And seeing as Capcom has recently put out a poll for Resident Evil titles to remake, now's the perfect time. Resident Evil 0 was definitely a game. It was made and it was sold, and it definitely didn't kill the franchise, but was it good? Yeah, not really. It had some serious issues, and some of them weren't really its fault. Just most of them. But we wouldn't be here if the game wasn't a serious fixer-upper now, would we? I'm the Resident Gremlin, and join me as we go about remaking Resident Evil 0. First, some ground rules. 1. We will be focusing on the meat and potatoes of the game, namely plot elements and gameplay aspects. Graphical and UI improvements are a given in a remake. 2. Any changes suggested should be meaningful improvements to the game. So, no moving the furniture 2 inches to the right. And 3. The game should be as true as possible to the original. Genre and setting, characters and plot need to remain as close as possible to the original title. Quick note, but obviously these are my personal thoughts and ideas, and I have no sodding clue how hard they would be to implement. It's more of a remake checklist than anything else. But without further ado, let's get started. But before anything else, let's just pull the pin. Obviously this has to be over the shoulder. They did it with 2 and 3 and they were better off for it, mostly. Fixed camera was nice enough, but it's had its time. Easy freebie to start off. Now let's actually talk about the gameplay of RE0. Zero has all the hallmarks of the OG Resident Evil games with one key difference. You control 2 characters. I know, 2002 was a wild time. I was 8, but the importance of this is twofold. Firstly, Rebecca and Billy have different strengths they bring to the table. Rebecca, being the team medic, can combine chemicals and mix herbs. And Billy's Billy. He's a beefy boy. It's not the most fleshed out system ever, but I've always been a huge fan of, asymmetrical co-op-y things. Secondly, you could control them separately and in completely different rooms, allowing for more interesting puzzles and level You probably see where I'm going with this. The game really does nothing to justify this mechanic for the most part. There are few instances where it's required, and by required I mean it forces you to split up for arbitrary reasons. And even then, the most optimal way to play is to dump Rebecca in a safe room and have a Beefcake Billy roam the halls doing literally everything, because you use Rebecca's chemical mixing a grand total of twice in the entire game. So we'll have to do something to make this relationship work, and honestly most of it is going to be puzzle related, which we'll look at later, but there's some more pressing matters we need to look into first. Specifically, where the did the item box go? Legitimately, for some reason they removed the item box from the game, and in its place they just added the floor. I'm sorry, the floor? The floor. You just drop items on the ground, but don't worry, they show up on the map where you've dropped them, and basically leaves the game looking like a hoarder's wet dream. There is legitimately no reason for them to have done this, and it just makes inventory management super awkward, especially considering both characters have 6 slots, and you end up basically juggling firearms around most of the game. The simple solution though, well, solutions. Firstly, bring back the item box. There is no reason for them to have removed it other than some misguided attempt at realism in an RE game. Go figure. Secondly, obviously, add the inventory slot system from the newer titles and remakes, but with the caveat that there's only enough to fully upgrade one of them, meaning you'd have to choose between sharing them evenly or making one of the characters a pack rat. We still need to validate the 2 character dynamic, of course, but we'll get to that soonish. Before that though, we need to talk about combat. You know, all the issues early Resident Evil games had? The awkward aiming, the fact that you spend most of your time shooting at dudes off screen. But at least you knew how many shots it takes to kill something. Well, not anymore, because we've now got damage drop off, where weapon damage lowers depending on how far the enemy is from you. This is patently stupid because A, the game never tells you this mechanic exists, B, it never explains what the range limits are, and C, I may not be a gunologist, but I'm pretty sure bullets don't lose damage the moment they leave the sodding barrel. No word of a lie, all conventional weapons, the handgun, the shotguns, the fucking Magnum, can lose 75 to 85% of their damage down a damned corridor, so you're punished for engaging enemies where you'd reasonably want to, i.e. not in melee range. It can end up taking around a dozen shots to kill a single zombie, which starts out as annoying and immediately becomes frustrating when you realise the game is really stingy on ammo and health items, and has doubled up enemies purely because there's two of you. Fixing this again is pretty straightforward. Firstly, remove the damage drop off so your shots will always do the same amount of damage. It never needed to exist and the game would have been a lot better off without it. Doing this would also have the added effect of making the lowered available ammo and the flood of enemies a little less punishing, as you know roughly how many bullets you're going to need. Oi! We'll get to you in a bit. If we're also doing the new style of gameplay too, we'll likely be going for self-defense items as well, but that's kind of a given at this point. Maybe give Billy the ability to block if he's carrying a larger weapon, or maybe do the Carlos punch from the RE Remake. There's also the minor issue where the game weirdly punishes you for not knowing when it's going to randomly separate the characters, meaning if you're stuck playing as Rebecca after giving Billy all your weapons, you just lose. It's a bit of an extreme case honestly, but definitely frustrating. However, this major irritation would be resolved partially by the new inventory system, so it's less of an issue. Seeing as we're talking about combat, we should probably talk about the recipients of all this hot lead. I can't really say anything bad about the zombies because, well, they're zombies. They fill the fodder niche expertly. It's the special monsters that are the issues. Because of how they feel to fight, yes, but also for just being bland. Because outside of 4 enemies, 2 of which are bosses and 1 is the hunters from RE1, all of the enemies in this game are just animal, but big. Giant spiders, giant roaches, giant frogs, not really giant but actually surprisingly worse than monkeys. They are genuinely boring and not all that memorable, and those that are memorable for the worst sodding reasons. Let's talk about the eliminators for example. These f***ing things. You know how the dog enemies are always super annoying to deal with due to their size and how fast they are? Well, Capcom managed to design an enemy that made me want the dogs back. These bosses are fast, jump all over the place, and have a grab attack that they can use to stun lock you to death. And because they seem to always appear in groups of 3, you need to use the shotgun or grenade launcher on them, as they can legitimately attack you faster than you can recover if they get close. Any encounter with them is just depressing, which is actually hilarious because you only ever have to fight them once in the entire game. It's honestly crazy how negatively that one encounter painted my entire experience with RE0. So we need to make them memorable and fun to fight, or at least a little more interesting. First off, the roaches. Make them slightly smaller. Instead of having them just scuttle at you to take a nibble, maybe give them an attack where they fly at you for the bite attack. Because if there's one thing that's horrifying, it's a flying roach. Next, the monkeys. My go-to would be retooling them as an ambush enemy, hiding in alcoves, rafters and around corners to leap out and attack the unobservant player. Obviously we need to give them context clues that they are there, claw marks on the walls, dust falling from above, etc. And you could space out encounters a little bit more so you have more time with them than just a single required room. Just remove the frog. It legitimately only exists to OHKO a player that doesn't know its grab is instant death. Wait, they only added 3 enemy types? Oh right, them. Getting to it. But before that, there's the bosses. Old school RE bosses were never that good. They were memorable, but they were always damage sponges and most of the time a big animal or naked man. And Zero is no different except for the memorable part. The bosses in the first half of the game just genuinely suck so much. Barely any interactions outside of shooting them until they stop moving, and absolutely zero build up for any of them. But Gremlin, surely having 2 characters adds an extra dimension to the fight. And you'd be correct if the game ever gave you the option to. Because out of the 7 bosses in the game, 4 of them have to be done solo. And hilariously, it's the first 4. They just didn't really think much about the 2 character system they built the game around. The only time having Billy and Rebecca around is used for anything in a boss fight is the final one, which is hilarious because it turns it into a solo fight again. From the top, Stinger. I genuinely don't have that much of an issue with this guy, if I'm honest. Yeah, he comes out of nowhere and the setup for the fight being solo is kinda dumb, but I do appreciate that it's an intro boss that's mostly hurt by future bosses. We could maybe change him to be in the cargo hold and that he just tears the entire carriage apart, giving more room to have a fight and allowing you to knock him off the train to be crushed under it. Kind of unrelated, but can we talk about how good the train section is in RE0? Of any starting area in any of them, it's so good and so well done that I wish they did it more. Anyway, moving on. Centurion. Old Captain Nothing Burger. This boss barely even does anything. His ass tendrils lash out at you if you get too close, and he's carrying Rebecca around the entire time, but otherwise he just walks around in circles, doing nothing. So here's what we do. Firstly, allow us to free Rebecca from the grab. Secondly, make Centurion more aggressive, charging around, climbing up walls in the ceiling to drop down for a slam attack, maybe going into the grates in the wall and then coming out of another to keep the player guessing. These ideas were the subject of 2 minutes of thought. Imagine what could be done if the effort was put in. Infected Bat. I'm not even kidding, that's what it's called. No fancy name or anything, just Bat. And the fight is ass. Flying enemy with fixed cameras and characteristically bad aiming made this genuinely frustrating from the start. Then the fight introduces a swarm of smaller bats and everything got so much worse. Another solo fight purely because someone has to keep the door open. Yeah, it's literally that dumb. Anyway, fix time. Firstly, over the shoulder fixes the aiming issue, so that's fine. But get rid of the lock mechanism and let the fight use both characters. Secondly, keep the swarm, but have it so that there's a flamethrower or something kicking around to get rid of them that also barely damages the boss. Why would there be a flamethrower in the church, you ask? Same reason there's a magnum and a gravestone. T001, aka the Proto-Tyrant. Now, the problem with this guy isn't actually the boss fights themselves, more how irreverent the game seems to be about a staple monster of the franchise. He just appears with no fanfare or build-up, just walks up to you over rubble and that's it. The second fight, he literally crawls out of a vat of shit. Rather than fixing the fight, my man needs to fix his image. Maybe have a few recordings or messages on computer screens stating the big man is free, so he gets the grandeur he bloody deserves. Leech Queen, arguably the best boss fight in the game, which would be serious praise if this were any other title. The problem is that, again, other than knowing who the main antagonist is for the entire game, this fight seems oddly out of nowhere. Dude starts vomiting leeches and then becomes a slimy thing. The second phase is kind of interesting, but come on! This is the final boss. You're in the same camp as Birkin, an OG nemesis for crying out loud. Where's the bloody spectacle? So let's dig in. First, change the venue. The first fight is in a small room full of pipes and goo and really isn't the aesthetic you want for a final boss. Maybe change it to an incinerator room where you can trick the boss onto a conveyor to torch it to death. Something other than just shooting it. Second fight should definitely still do the open the roof thing, but have it so that we can drop explosive barrels or construction materials on the boss to slow it down, rather than just having to shoot it until it loses all interest in Rebecca. The way you kill this boss is still kinda dumb, but at least it's a little bit more of a too much to handle alone kind of deal than it is now. Okay, fine. I've been tiptoeing around this for far too long, so let's just rip off the bandage. As you may or may not know, each RE title has its own signature monster. RE1 had the Hunters, RE2 had Lickers, and RE3 had Nemesis. And RE0 has the Leechmen, or as they're officially called, Mimicry Marcuses. We'll stick with Leechmen, thank you. At the start I actually liked the Leechmen, I found their design to be pretty cool. Cut to the end of the game and I never wanted to see them again. Why? Well, I bought an itemised list. 1. They are the only enemy that the damage drop-off benefits directly, because they have ranged attacks that can hit both characters at the same time for up to 15 to 20% of Billy and Rebecca's total HP respectively, while you end up doing piddly damage until they're in close range, at which point they can do 25 to 33% of your health instead. And if you try to juke them, the corridors are so narrow and their grab range is so long that they could catch you basically at any time, which is more or less a death sentence. Neat. And remember, not a lot of health pickup, so you will likely not be healthy when the game throws these guys at you. Number 2, they are tanky as balls. As standard, these wobbly boys have 200 or 300 HP, which doesn't sound a lot, but when you realise Billy Buffman has 250 max, it adds a little perspective. Add on top of this that they do not flinch when hit by anything, so you're essentially forced to use the grenade launcher on them, or Molotovs, which are stupid strong but awkward as hell to use. And even when you burn through their health, their legs still move and they have another full pool to get through, meaning they have health equivalent to bosses. Luckily, the legs explode after a while and can actually insta-kill any character from full. Oh, what a fun idea, Capcom. Number 3, the sheer number of them. I went ahead and counted and there's 9 of these bastards. 9 boss tier enemies in tight corridors that can and likely will murder the living hell out of you repeatedly if you're not prepared or don't know they're coming. Basically, these frustrating floppy foes are an absolute pain in the ass, but conceptually they are pretty cool, so let's fix them up a bit. Instead of there being loads of them walking around, why not just make it the one? Treat it like Mr. X, but instead of having him stalk the halls, have it travel around vents and the like and pop up to ambush the player sporadically throughout the game until you can finally take it down in the lab by freezing or burning it, sort of like the regenerator in Dead Space. Obviously you have to make them unable to follow you into certain rooms and have a means to drive them off, like dealing damage or firebombing it a bit, but I feel like having one boss-like monster would be healthier than just having the boss squad. Oh look, we're finally at the puzzle section of the video. If you made it this far, congrats! How are you doing? Remember to stay hydrated. Puzzles were always core to the RE formula in the early days, and a number of them are remembered quite vividly for how involved or esoteric they are. It is something that RE0 definitely does not subscribe to. There are 4 puzzles in the entire game that require all that much thought, and 2 of them can be quite easily brute forced. Most other puzzles are either glorified fetch quests or the game literally just gives you the answer. And this is encapsulated perfectly during the lab section. It is a forced separation section where Billy and Rebecca are on different floors and you have to alternate between the characters to progress through this string of puzzles. And again, by puzzles I actually mean a gauntlet of grabbing an item to give to the other character, who then uses that item to grab another item to give it to another character for 10 minutes if you know what you're doing. Which absolutely sucks, considering it's the only real instance where the separating the characters actually matters, and it's the most bare bones section of the entire game. The only part of it that I would actually consider a puzzle is the combination lock on the tram room right at the end of it. I can't believe I'm actually going to say this, but RE6 has better puzzles for this kind of thing. But that's not praise for RE6, by the way, that's just a complete demolition of RE0. So we need to make the puzzles more involved, whilst also making the separation mechanic more of a requirement than a suggestion. Not really something easily done, but one option would be adding more of, or just building on, the puzzle in the test room, where Rebecca has to direct Billy through a room to another button. As it currently stands, it's very basic and you only have to press 2 buttons, but there is definitely room to improve it to something a little bit more involved. But we need more than that, because you can do that type of puzzle maybe once before players become bored of it. So it's time to play the wild card I've been holding ever since I started thinking about an RE0 remake. Make it co-op, or at least co-op compatible. The main problem with splitting up in a single player game is that you're just referring information to yourself, which could just as easily be done with one character and literally has in previous RE titles. The best example of what I'm looking for would be the We Were Here series of games, which is built entirely around one player directing another through puzzles, either by relaying information or telling them where they need to go, which would make the lab puzzle a lot more interesting, but this is where things get a little bit messy. Because you still probably want to keep the single player aspect of the game there, which is pretty difficult if you need a second player walking you through the puzzle. The only option I can think of would be to have the AI character relay details through voice lines that don't just outright give you the puzzle solution. As you can tell, this bit has a far less cut and dry answer, purely because make a good puzzle isn't as easy as it sounds. Maybe a video for another time. I'm really not one to suggest heavy editing of the plot for remakes. On the contrary, I believe that a remake should be as accurate to the original story as possible. But there are some weird issues with the game's characterization and story that hinder it from being great. First off, the relationship between Billy and Rebecca. Rebecca is a rookie member of STARS, and Billy is literally a death row convict that was accused of killing 23 men and is assumed to have killed the people transporting him to his execution. While their initial meeting started off as confrontational for obvious reasons, that plot point falls off the sodding cliff by the time they reach the mansion. Realistically, until they get to the point where Billy saves Rebecca from the random bottomless pit in the basement, just don't think about it. They should be wary of each other, because up to that point, neither one of them has really gone out of their way, put their own life on the line to save the other. It is a partnership of convenience, and Rebecca specifically should be prepared for Billy to throw her to the wolves at any moment. We could easily work on this with the characters actually talking to each other, throwing barbs and the like. Give the sense that the team only exists because it's beneficial for both parties at the moment, and I feel this needs to be reflected more in their interactions. Secondly, we have the antagonist of the game. RE0 is a very weird title for the series up to this point, because it reveals the villain and his motives in the first couple of hours, and it's this guy. This Final Fantasy looking ass that sings opera, makes edgy threats and one-liners, and makes speeches about holy shit, he is a Final Fantasy character. Ignoring that though, there is a glaring issue with this. Other than him admitting he caused all of this and is swearing revenge, he doesn't do anything. He's not really an active force in the game, and you only interact with him in the final boss fights. There's no intrigue or anything. You aren't trying to piece a story together because the who and the why is already known. Compare this to RE1 with Wesker or Nikolai in RE3. You know that they're up to something fishy, but you don't know what or to what end. Well, Nikolai is different because he's very clearly evil and self-serving, but the end goal isn't clear. Honestly, what they need to do is make him a bit more cloak and dagger and cryptic, maybe actively toying with the players a bit without him just giving an itemised explanation of his ultimate end goal. Better to keep your survival horror antagonists subtle and secretive than whatever the hell they did here. And while not really related but sort of linked, progression's a bit balked in this game. Mostly in the fact that you get the grenade launcher about 1.5 to 2 hours into a casual playthrough. It's nothing game breaking or anything, but you basically get every weapon in the game before the second boss. Maybe with all the changes they can afford to hold off on the heavy ordnance just a little bit, and that's it. That's what I'd change if they ever did an RE0 remake. Do you agree? Do you not? Have I missed anything that really needs changing? I have been the Resident Gremlin, and I'll see you next time.